The slam of the back door shook my old wooden house as if an earthquake had struck. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was gently stirring a pot of soup when the sound of angry footsteps echoed down the hallway. "Mama, where are you?" The voice was sharp, demanding, filled with an anger that pierced my bones. I wiped my hands on my apron and stepped into the living room. My son, Harold, now 45 years old, stood in front of me, his chest heaving, his fists tight. His dark brown eyes, so much like his late father's, burned with a fury I had not seen in decades. "Why did Denise call me crying, saying you refused to let her use your bank account?" Harold's words came at me like arrows, slicing the air. "She said she was standing in line at the pharmacy, embarrassed in front of strangers, because the payment wouldn't go through." I stood frozen for a moment, the wooden spoon still in my hand. 82 years of life had taught me patience, had taught me to endure storms, but this was a storm that brewed inside my own home. "Harold," I said softly, but firmly, "lower your voice. We can talk like decent people. Talk." "Mama, she needed medicine, and you humiliated her." His face turned red, and the veins in his neck swelled. I took a deep breath. "The money in that account is mine, Harold. I worked for it, I saved it, and I manage it. I don't leave it open for just anyone." "Just anyone? You're talking about my wife, Mama. She's your family." His voice thundered louder, bouncing off the walls. I placed the spoon on the table, trying to steady my trembling hands. Denise had been spending recklessly for months, and I had watched my savings shrink in ways that didn't make sense. A few weeks earlier, I had found charges for jewelry, expensive clothes, and even a weekend trip I knew nothing about. But instead of throwing all of that in Harold's face, I tried to keep calm. "If you or Denise need something important, you can come to me directly," I said, my tone as even as I could manage. "But I will not give away my account number or leave my money unprotected." Harold's eyes narrowed. "Unprotected? You're acting like we're thieves. Denise is your daughter-in-law. She has every right to be trusted." I walked to my armchair by the window, the same chair where I had once rocked Harold to sleep when he was a baby, and lowered myself down. My back ached, but I needed to be sitting to keep my composure. "Denise is welcome here, always. But access to my money is not part of the welcome." He paced the floor like a man possessed, his shoes pounding the wooden boards. Sweat dripped from his forehead though the room was cool. "I can't believe this. You spent your whole life giving to others' neighbors, church folk, strangers even, and now when your own family needs you, you turn into a miser." That word stung deeper than any insult I had ever known. Miser. I who had scrubbed floors and washed clothes for decades to raise this man after his father passed. I who had sacrificed vacations, rest, and even food on my own plate to put him through college. I who had helped him buy his first house when he married Denise. Miser. "Harold," I said, my voice shaking, "I will not let you talk to me this way in my home." "Then give me a reason. Why suddenly block us out like this?" His hands trembled with rage. "Because I saw things in my statements I didn't authorize. Too many expenses that I never agreed to." For the first time, he went quiet. His breathing was heavy, his jaw tight. Then he said, "Denise told me she always asked you before using the money." "She did not," I replied quickly, before my mind could warn my lips. "She has been lying." Silence fell heavy, thick. Harold's eyes widened, as though I had slapped him across the face. "Don't you dare insult my wife," he whispered, his voice low and dangerous. "I am not insulting her," I said, my chest tight. "I am telling the truth, the truth." "Mama, you're losing touch. Maybe it's time somebody else took care of your finances." The words struck like lightning. My own son, the boy I raised with sweat and sacrifice, now questioning my mind, my capacity. "Harold," I said slowly, standing up even as my knees complained, "this conversation is over. I want you to leave." He stared at me with eyes colder than ice. "I'm not going anywhere until you give me that account number." "No." I met his gaze, though my heart pounded. "Not today. Not ever." His lips curled into a bitter smile. "You'll regret this. Denise is crushed. If you keep this up, don't be surprised if she wants nothing more to do with you. Then that will be her choice, I answered. He shook his head, disgusted. You always preached about family. Well, remember this, Mama. Families don't keep secrets. Families share everything. If you don't, then maybe you're the one breaking this family apart. The door slammed as he stormed out, and I stood alone, trembling in my living room. The clock ticked on the wall, steady, unbothered, while my heart raced like a drum. 45 years of motherhood, and here I was, accused by my only son of selfishness, of madness, all because I dared to say no. The silence in the house after Harold left was not the kind of silence that comforts. It was the kind that supplicates. I sat back down in my armchair, the one that had carried me through decades of evenings, and closed my eyes for just a moment. But the words he had thrown at me would not leave. Miser, foolish, losing touch. I replayed them like a broken record, over and over, each repetition heavier than the last. I tried to breathe deeply, to remind myself that I was still in my home, still in control of my life, but it felt as if he had managed to steal even the air from my lungs. The phone rang suddenly, jolting me back to the present. I didn't move to pick it up. After 3 rings, the answering machine clicked, and Denise's voice poured through the room, sharp and filled with accusation. Sylvia, I know you're there. I don't understand why you are treating us like this. Harold is devastated. We are your family. Families help one another. You should be ashamed. And then the click of disconnection, final and cold. I rose and went to the kitchen, because when the storms of life come, I cook. Cooking has always been my refuge. The rhythm of peeling potatoes, chopping onions, stirring a potit keeps my mind from unraveling. But that day, as I peeled, my hands trembled, and tears blurred my vision. My son's face, twisted in anger, kept appearing in the steam rising from the pot. His words were louder than the crackle of the stove. It was then that I understood this was not about one password, one account, or one argument. It was about boundaries that had been crossed so many times they had disappeared. It was about control, about the fact that for the first time in years, I had told them no. My life had been built on structure, and that structure had saved me when Robert, my husband, died nearly 4 decades ago. Harold was only 13 then, a lanky boy with more questions than I had answers for. To survive, I created routines. Mornings with coffee in the old percolator Robert had given me. Afternoons tending to my small garden. Evenings preparing simple dinners that carried us through long days of grief. Rules, schedules, order, they were my weapons against chaos. And for many years, they worked. I raised Harold to be disciplined, respectful, hardworking. He went to university to study architecture, and I was so proud. I remember attending his graduation, wearing the dress I had mended 3 times just to look presentable, clapping until my hands ached when they called his name. 4 years after that, our bond was strong. Harold would stop by every Sunday for supper, just the 2 of us, sharing stories, laughter, and silence when words weren't needed. He handled my taxes while I cooked his favorite cornbread. I gave him advice on women, on patience, on life. I believed I had done right by him. But everything began to shift when Denise entered the picture. The first time Harold introduced her, I was setting the table with chicken stew bubbling on the stove. He walked in with the wide grin of a teenager again, holding the hand of a tall woman with carefully styled hair and a scent that lingered like expensive perfume. "Mama, this is Denise," he said with pride. She reached out to shake my hand, her nails long and painted a bright crimson. Her grip was firm, but her eyes darted over my small house as if cataloging its flaws. Still, she smiled. "It's a pleasure, Mrs. Johnson. I've heard so much about you." That night, Denise praised my cooking, asked polite questions, and even helped clear the dishes. She seemed eager to fit in. I remember thinking, Harold has chosen well. For several weeks, their visits were pleasant. She brought flowers once, folded napkins neatly, and even told stories about her job as a real estate agent, how she worked hard to sell luxury apartments downtown. She was ambitious, charming, and Harold looked happier than I had seen him in years. When they married, I contributed a large portion to the expenses without hesitation. It was Harold's only wedding, my only chance to see him take a wife, and I wanted it to be perfect. Denise chose the dress, the flowers, the music, the menu. I only signed the checks and smiled for photographs. And at first, everything seemed fine. They came for Sunday dinners, told me about their new apartment, and for a time, the house was full of laughter again. But slowly, the favors began. At first, small and innocent. "Sylvia, could you help us with a couple hundred this month? The rent is a bit higher than expected." Denise's voice was sweet, almost shy, and Harold nodded in agreement. Of course I said yes. Then it was 300, then 5. "Just until Harold gets his bonus," she'd promise. The bonus never seemed to come. 6 months later, the small favors had turned into nearly $7,000. One Sunday, as I served roast chicken, I brought it up gently. "Children, you know I don't mind helping, but this is a lot of money already." Harold stiffened, looked at his plate, and muttered, "Mama, we'll pay you back. Stop keeping such exact accounts." His words cut, though he meant them casually. Denise smiled quickly, trying to smooth things over. "You're right, Sylvia. We've been careless. We'll do better." But they never did. And that was just the beginning of the unraveling. The pattern of requests grew like weeds in a garden I had once kept tidy. At first, I could still convince myself it was temporary, that Harold and Denise were simply adjusting to married life, to the weight of new bills and responsibilities. But soon the excuses multiplied faster than I could count. One week it was the electricity bill, the next it was money for Denise's professional clothes, then car repairs, then groceries. Always some urgent need, always framed as if refusing would be cruel. I began to feel less like a mother and more like a bank with a heartbeat. One evening, Denise called me while I was preparing a casserole. Her voice was desperate. "Sylvia, my mother fell ill and I need to buy her medicine, but I'm short on cash. Could I borrow your debit card? Just for a day." The word medicine pulled at my heart. I thought of Robert in his last months, how the cost of pills had drained us dry. Without hesitation, I agreed. "Just for today," I said, convincing myself it was harmless. That night, I logged into my account out of habit. There was indeed a charge from the pharmacy, but right below it, 3 more entries made my stomach twist. A boutique, a shoe store, and a restaurant downtown all in the same afternoon. Over $600 gone in hours. My hand shook as I held the printout, but I told myself it was a misunderstanding. When I asked Denise the next day, she burst into tears. "I'm so sorry, Sylvia. I just got carried away, but I promise to repay you next week." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe I hadn't been foolish. But a week turned into a month, and a month into a year. Slowly, I lost track of how much had disappeared. I no longer logged into my account with peace of mind. Each time, I braced myself for disappointment. The numbers sank lower and lower, like sand slipping through my fingers. My life savings, decades of sacrifice, were being devoured by someone else's appetite. The Sunday dinners that once filled my home with joy became sessions of subtle negotiation. Denise would arrive with a charming smile, but always with a list of upcoming emergencies. "We need to travel for Harold's work meeting," she'd explain while pouring herself another glass of tea. "We can't show up in the same old clothes." Or, "The car is unreliable." And Harold can't risk being late for important clients. Each statement was coded with justification, but underneath, it was the same request: money. Harold, my son, the boy I had raised to know right from wrong, rarely contradicted her. He sat silently, nodding, sometimes adding a line about how much pressure he faced at work as an architect, how reputation and appearance mattered. I watched him avoid my eyes, and I knew he was slipping further into her way of thinking. That silence hurt me more than any words. One afternoon, while I watered the roses in the yard, the phone rang again. Denise's voice rushed through the line. "Sylvia, my credit card is blocked, and I need to pay for a business dinner tonight. Could you lend me yours?" It's urgent, really urgent. Against my better judgment, I agreed. By morning, the balance showed charges for designer handbags, perfume, and a spa visit. Not a single dollar related to any business dinner. I confronted her that Sunday. Denise, this can't go on. These aren't necessities. This is not what I agreed to. She lowered her eyes, put a trembling hand to her forehead, and said, "You don't understand the kind of image we need to maintain. Harold's career depends on it." Harold sat beside her, silent, complicit. That night I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, my thoughts circling like vultures. How had I become so blind? When had love turned into exploitation? My home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a place where I was cornered. The savings I had protected all my life were vanishing, and the son I had given everything to no longer stood by my side. The breaking point came months later, when my bank called to verify a charge of $1,400 at an electronics store. "Did you authorize this purchase, Mrs. Johnson?" the agent asked. My chest tightened. "No," I whispered. "Block the card immediately." I hung up and sat at the kitchen table, shaking. Denise had told me she needed my card for groceries that week. Groceries, yet $1,400 was gone to gadgets I would never use. Minutes later, the phone rang again. Denise's voice screamed through the receiver. "What did you do?" I was left standing at the register like a fool. "How could you humiliate me like this?" "It's my card, Denise," I said firmly. "And I will not let unauthorized purchases continue." Her silence on the other end was deafening. Then she laughed nervously and muttered, "It was for Harold. He needed new equipment for work." We couldn't wait, but in that moment, I knew the truth. This wasn't about work, or emergencies, or family. It was about greed, and the belief that I was too weak, too old, to say no. And that realization burned hotter than any insult. The days that followed were heavy, as if the very walls of my house carried the weight of betrayal. I could not shake the image of Harold's silent face beside Denise while she justified every expense, every lie. I sat at my dining table one morning with a pile of bank statements spread out like battlefield maps. Line after line, I traced the numbers, each transaction telling the story of how I had been drained. 2 years earlier, my savings had stood at nearly $50,000, my cushion for old age, my security after a life of work. Now, less than half remained, and most of it had slipped through my fingers without my consent. Expensive restaurants, clothing boutiques, jewelry, weekend trips, all things I had never once purchased for myself. I remembered the feeling in my chest as I turned page after page, a mixture of anger and grief. Anger that they had used me, grief that the boy I raised had let it happen. I picked up the phone, my hands trembling, and called the bank. "I want a full report of all transactions for the last 24 months, I said. The woman on the other end was polite, professional, but I could hear the concern in her voice when I explained that there were purchases I didn't recognize. "We'll send you the documents by certified mail, Mrs. Johnson," she assured me. "In the meantime, I recommend you check if anyone else has access to your card details." Anyone else? My stomach dropped at those words. That night, unable to sleep, I opened the small wooden box in my bedroom where I kept my most important papers, the deed to the house, my passport, old letters from Robert. At the very bottom, I found something that made my blood run cold. A photocopy of my debit card front and back with the security code visible. In the corner, in Denise's elegant handwriting, was a small note, "For emergencies. D." My knees nearly gave out. I had never given her permission to copy my card. She must have taken it when I wasn't looking, when she claimed she was helping with laundry or setting the table. How long had she been using my information freely? How many of those charges were made without even the courtesy of asking? The next morning, the phone rang. It was Denise, her tone sugar-sweet but edged with steel. "Sylvia, I've missed you. We haven't talked since the other day. I hope you're ready to move past this. Harold and I can't live under this tension." I didn't answer her demands directly. Instead, I said, "Denise, I found a copy of my card in my papers. Do you know anything about that? There was a long pause on the other end, then a laugh far too casual. Oh, that. Don't be dramatic. I made that copy once in case of an emergency. Families should trust one another, shouldn't they? Her words chilled me more than her silence had. Families should trust one another. Yes, but trust was not meant to be trampled. Trust was not meant to be exploited. I ended the call quickly, my hands shaking so badly I could barely set the phone down. For the rest of the day, I wandered through my home like a stranger, touching the walls Robert had painted, the furniture I had polished for decades, the curtains I had sewn myself. Every corner of this house told the story of sacrifice, of survival. And now, that history was being rewritten by greed. On Sunday, they came uninvited. Harold walked in as though nothing had happened, Denise trailing behind him with her usual air of entitlement. "Mama, we need to talk," Harold began, his tone weary, as if I had caused all his troubles. I stood in the center of the living room, my arms crossed, the sunlight from the window casting long shadows across the floor. "There's nothing more to discuss," I said. I blocked the card, and that decision stands. Denise sat on my sofa without being asked. "Sylvia, you're overreacting. All those purchases were discussed with you. Maybe you just don't remember." The audacity of her words stole my breath. To claim I was forgetting, as if age had robbed me of clarity. "I remember quite clearly," I said sharply. "I never agreed to a $1,400 computer, nor to jewelry or spa visits." "You lied, Denise." Harold finally spoke, his voice tired. "Mama, sometimes emergencies change. We do what's necessary in the moment. That computer was a bargain, and I needed it for work." My heart sank. My son, the man I had raised to value honesty, now stood before me justifying lies as bargains, deceit as necessity. "If you needed it for work, Harold, then buy it with your own money," I said. Denise shot to her feet, indignation in every gesture. "I knew you would twist this. You always make us feel like beggars when we just want help." "I don't make you feel like anything," I answered, my voice steady but firm. "You choose to take advantage of my kindness, and that ends today." The air in the room turned heavy, almost suffocating. Harold's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Finally, I looked at them both and said, "I want you to leave. Now." They hesitated, shocked that I had stood so firmly, but eventually Harold turned toward the door. "We'll talk again when you've calmed down," he muttered. The door closed, and I was left once again in silence. But this silence was different. It was not the silence of peace, nor of grief. It was the silence of a battle line drawn, a war I had not asked for but could no longer avoid. The next 3 days were quiet, too quiet. No calls from Harold, no sudden knocks at the door from Denise, no emergencies that needed solving. At first I felt relief, as though a heavy stone had been lifted from my chest. But soon that silence became something else, a looming pause, like the air before a storm breaks. I woke early each morning, made my coffee, and sat on the patio watching the sun creep over the garden. Yet even as the roses bloomed, and the jasmine released its sweet fragrance, I felt no joy. My mind circled endlessly around the same questions. How had my own son grown into a man who could betray me this way? How had I allowed Denise to weave herself into every corner of my life, until even my bank account was not my own? By Friday, I could not bear the uncertainty any longer. I sat down at my desk, opened my computer, and logged into my online bank account. The number on the screen nearly stole the breath from my lungs. 2 years ago, I had $48,000 in savings. Now, just over 22 remained. More than half of what I had worked for all my life was gone. My hands shook as I printed every statement from the last 24 months. The printer roared for almost half an hour, spitting page after page, until the stack towered on my dining room table. I spread them out carefully, as though I were examining holy scriptures, each line a verse telling the story of my naivety. March, $650 at a jewelry store. April, $1,200 at an electronics shop. May, $300 at a spa. June, $800 on clothing boutiques. July, $400 on cosmetics. August, $900 at a resort hotel I had never set foot in. My chest tightened with each discovery. I thought of the days I had worked double shifts at the laundry, scrubbing strangers' clothes until my fingers bled. I thought of the nights I had gone without meals so Harold could eat well. And now, that sacrifice had been squandered on perfumes, shoes, dinners, and vacations I had never enjoyed. I called the bank again, my voice shaking but steady enough to make demands. "Send me the official report of every transaction for the last 2 years," I said, "and block any possibility of additional cards being linked to my account." The agent assured me it would be done. But even as she spoke, my mind churned with images of Denise holding my card, Denise signing receipts, Denise laughing at salespeople while spending my money. Later that evening, I pulled out the shoebox where I kept letters from Robert, his handwriting still strong and bold after all these years. One letter in particular caught my eye, one he wrote when Harold was born. "Take care of him, Sylvia. Raise him strong, raise him honest. He will be the man who carries our name with pride." Tears blurred the ink as I traced the words with my finger. What would Robert think now? Would he blame me for failing to protect the boy we had loved so fiercely? Saturday arrived with gray skies. I was in the kitchen preparing cornbread when the front door opened without a knock. Harold and Denise walked in as if the house belonged to them. Denise's perfume filled the air before she spoke a word. "Sylvia," she began, her tone falsely sweet, "we need to settle this nonsense once and for all." I turned slowly, wiping my hands on a towel. "This is not nonsense," I said. "This is theft." Her smile froze, sharp as glass. "Theft? How dare you accuse us of that? We are your family." Harold's voice was softer, almost pleading. "Mama, please, don't use words like that. You know we never meant to hurt you." I shook my head. "You didn't mean to hurt me, but you did. Look at these statements." I pointed to the table, covered in pages of transactions. Over $26,000 gone. Do you deny it? Neither of them moved toward the table. Neither dared to look. Instead, Harold sighed, ran a hand over his face, and said, "We need to know we can count on you. That's all we're asking." I felt a strength rise in me I hadn't known in years. "No, Harold. What you are asking is for me to surrender. To hand over everything I worked for. And that, I will never do." Denise crossed her arms, her voice dripping with contempt. "If that's how you want it, don't expect us to keep coming around. You'll end up alone in this big old house, and it'll be your own fault. Alone." The word echoed in the quiet that followed. I looked at my son, my only child, waiting for him to defend me, to stand beside me. But his silence was deafening. At last, I spoke, my voice calm but firm. "If you choose to leave me because I protect myself, then so be it. I would rather sit in this house alone than be a prisoner in my own home, ruled by lies and greed." The room went still. Then Harold turned away, Denise trailing behind him, and the door closed with a dull thud. I stood there for a long while, staring at the wood grain of the door, wondering if that sound was not just their exit, but the breaking of something that could never be repaired. That night, the house felt colder than it ever had, though the summer air outside was heavy and warm. I walked from room to room, running my hand over the familiar furniture. The framed photographs on the walls, the old quilts folded neatly at the ends of chairs. Everything was still, yet nothing felt the same. The silence pressed against me, not peaceful but suffocating, reminding me that Harold's words were not idle. If I continued to resist, I might very well be left alone. And yet, deep in my chest, another truth burned brighter. I would rather be alone with dignity than surrounded by those who fed on me like wolves, circling prey. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my routines. Morning coffee in the same chipped cup Robert had given me, tending to my flowers before the heat of the day, humming old hymns while folding laundry. But every small act of normal life felt tainted by what had transpired. The garden that once brought me solace now seemed like a reminder of all that was fragile, blooms that could be crushed, stems that could snap. I thought of Harold as a boy, running barefoot through this same yard, chasing butterflies, his laughter filling the air. How had that innocent child grown into a man who could sit silently while his wife drained my life's savings? By midweek, the official bank documents arrived in a thick envelope. I set them on the dining table, the same table where Robert and I had once shared meals and stories, and began to sift through the evidence. Each page was like a knife. Designer boutiques, five-star restaurants, luxury hotels, electronics stores, purchases in neighborhoods I had never visited, for items I would never use. The total was undeniable. More than $26,000 spent in less than 2 years, nearly all under the guise of emergencies. I held the stack of papers against my chest, tears streaming down my face. Not only for the money, but for the trust that had been shattered. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Harold arrived alone. His shoulders were slumped, his tie loosened, his eyes tired. For a moment, I glimpsed the boy he once was, the boy who had cried into my arms when Robert died, the boy who had once promised he would always take care of me. He sat down across from me at the table without a word. The silence stretched long before he finally spoke. "Mama, Denise is upset. She feels you don't accept her, that you treat her like an outsider." I stared at him, stunned. "This is not about acceptance, Harold. This is about lies. About money that was stolen from me." He winced, as if my words physically hurt. "Mama, please don't say stolen. We're family. We've always shared everything." "Shared?" I leaned forward, my voice trembling with restrained fury. "I scrubbed floors to pay your tuition. I skipped meals to keep this house afloat. I gave you everything I had, Harold. That was sharing, but this is taking, and taking without asking is theft, no matter what name you give it." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he whispered, "She says you'll regret this. That when you're older and weaker, you'll wish you had us by your side." The cruelty of those words, delivered so calmly, cut deeper than any shout. I sat back, my chest aching. If the only way to have you by my side is to hand over what's mine, then I would rather face old age alone. For the first time, Harold's eyes softened. He looked at me, really looked, and I saw the war inside him. But just as quickly, the walls went back up. He stood and adjusted his tie. "Think about it, Mama. Think about what kind of life you want." Then he left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway like the toll of a distant bell. I sat at that table long after the door closed, staring at the neat stack of papers that had cost me not just money but peace. My hands trembled as I reached for Robert's old Bible, worn and soft from years of touch. I opened it at random and read aloud to the empty room. "Better a little with righteousness than much gain with injustice." The words sank into me like water into dry soil. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of clarity. This was not just about money. This was about my soul, my dignity, my right to live my final years without fear. If Harold and Denise wanted to abandon me for that, so be it. I would not bend. I would not surrender. But deep down, I knew the battle was far from over. The next morning I woke before the birds, the sky still a deep blue bruise over the rooftops, and stood in the kitchen listening to the old house breathe. I brewed coffee in Robert's dented percolator, and, with the steam curling against my face, made a decision that felt like pulling a thorn from my own flesh. I would take my life back, inch by stubborn inch. I dressed in my Sunday best skirt, stiff navy wool that made me stand taller, and walked to the bus stop with a folder under my arm, statements, photocopies, notes I'd scrawled in the margins at 3 in the morning. At the first branch of my bank, I asked for a private room. The manager was young enough to be my grandson, his beard too neat to be accidental, his eyes kind but careful. I laid out my papers like a pastor lays out scripture and spoke calmly, clearly, as if naming each transaction might shrink it back to a number and not a wound. He listened without interrupting, then flagged half a dozen charges as disputed, froze any companion cards, and helped me set new security questions that only I would know: the name of my first choir director, the county where Robert and I eloped at 19, the title of the hymn he asked me to sing when the pain kept him awake. I walked out with a new debit card I promised myself I would never let out of my sight, a fraud case number, and a small breath of clean air in my lungs. From there I went 2 blocks to the community legal clinic, A modest storefront with a bell that jingled like a dime store memory. A woman with silver braids and reading glasses on a chain listened while I told the whole story, her pen skittering quietly across a yellow pad. "What you're describing," she said finally, "not unkind, is financial exploitation of an elder. It often hides in love's clothing." The words landed with the force of truth. She explained my options letters, demanding repayment, restraining access, even a protection order if the pressure turned to threats. She suggested I keep a log of every contact, every request, every manipulation dressed up as emergency. She slid a pamphlet across the desk with a phone number for Adult Protective Services if the storm worsens, she said, meeting my eyes so I understood she believed it could. On the bus home, a high school girl offered me her seat, and I almost wept at the softness of it. I thought of Harold at that age, knobby knees, shoes too big, a laugh that shook the windows, and I wondered when the world taught him that taking was easier than asking. Back at the house, I changed the lock on the side door with a kit I bought at the hardware store. The clerk tried to send a boy to help. I told him these hands had fixed more things than that boy had broken. I put the new bank card in a fabric pouch and wore it beneath my blouse like a talisman. I called the utilities and added passcodes to every account. I placed Robert's Bible on the hall table as if it were a watchman. By late afternoon, my neighbor, Mrs. Briggs, the retired school librarian with a spine like a yardstick, knocked, with lemon bars and a look that said she knew more than she was asking. "I heard raised voices the other day," she murmured. "You know you can call me, even if it's just to sit in my kitchen and pretend we're shelling peas." I told her enough to make her nod fiercely, and write her number a second time in my little address book labeled help. Before she left, she put her hand on my shoulder. "You are not confusion," she said in that librarian voice that brooks no argument. "You are clarity." For 2 blessed days the phone slept. Then Sunday came like a test. Harold showed up just before dusk, not with Denise but with a man I had never seen, broad-shouldered, hair buzzed low, jaw tight. "Mama, this is Vince," Harold said, not meeting my eyes. "He can help us put things in order." The way he said help made my skin prickle. Vince leaned against the doorframe as if he'd found a nail to hang his weight on. "Ms. Johnson," he said, voice smooth as a radio host's. "Families do better when assets are centralized. Fewer mistakes that way." I felt the old floor tilt under me and righted it with the steadiness of my breath. "We won't be centralizing anything," I answered. "And there will be no discussions today." Harold stepped forward, palms open, as if I were a skittish animal. "Mama, be reasonable. Vince can move your funds into an account that covers all of us. Streamline the bills." "No," I said, and it shocked me how firm and quiet it sounded. "You will leave now." Vince's smile thinned. "It'd be a shame," he said, "if things got complicated." He didn't have to add for an old woman. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and held up my phone with the emergency screen glowing like a small moon. "Complications," I said, "arrive faster when invited." For a moment we stood in a triangle of breath and stubbornness. Then Harold tugged at Vince's sleeve. "Let's go," he muttered, anger and something like embarrassment warring on his face. They left with a promise that didn't sound like a promise at all. "We'll be back when you've had time to think." After the door latched, my hands shook so badly I had to sit. I called the non-emergency police line the clinic had circled on my pamphlet and explained, in that same steady voice I had found at the bank, that I feared pressure might become intimidation. 2 officers came by, young enough to call me ma'am without irony, and one of them Freckles. Green eyes said gently, "We see this, more than you'd think. Document everything. If they step past your threshold after you tell them to leave, call us." He left a card and a sense that I was not invisible. That night I slept with the bedroom door cracked so I could see the sliver of light from the hall. The Bible's shape a dark, faithful square on the table. I dreamed of Robert building a fence not to keep love out, but to teach it where the gate was. When I woke, dawn was pinking the blinds, and inside me something small but stubborn had survived. A pilot light, refusing to go out. The following week stretched long, every day heavy with anticipation. I kept the blinds half drawn and the doors locked, listening for the sound of tires on the gravel or fists against the wood. But the house remained still, except for the creaks of age and the hum of the refrigerator. I tried to reclaim my rhythm coffee at dawn, watering the garden, sewing the hem of an old skirt, but each task was shadowed by the memory of Vince leaning in my doorway, his voice polished and poisonous. At 82, I had known many kinds of storms, but this one carried a chill I could not ignore. On Wednesday morning, the mail brought the thick packet from the bank. I sat at the dining table with my reading glasses and a pencil, marking every purchase that bore Denise's fingerprints. Spa treatments, luxury salons, boutiques in neighborhoods where I had never stepped foot. The numbers told the story of slow erosion, not one great theft but thousands of little cuts that had drained me nearly dry. I thought of Robert again, how he used to say that a roof didn't collapse from a single leak, it was the steady drip, 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 that rotted the beams. My family's beams were rotting, and I had ignored the sound of water for too long. That afternoon, Harold returned, this time without Vince. He looked worn, his tie crooked, his face lined with exhaustion. He didn't shout when he entered, didn't even remove his shoes, just stood in the doorway with eyes that couldn't meet mine. "Mama, Denise says you hate her," he muttered, voice low. "She says you never wanted her in this family." I closed the folder of statements and pushed it aside. "This is not about hate, Harold. This is about respect. Respect for me, for the life I built, for the sacrifices I made." My voice cracked, but I did not look away. He sank into a chair and rubbed his temples. "She thinks you're choosing money over us." His words pierced deeper than he knew, because I had always chosen them. Every dollar, every hour, every piece of myself had gone to Harold and the home we shared. "No," I answered softly, "I am choosing survival. I am choosing dignity. Money can be earned, but once respect is gone, it doesn't come back." For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy but almost tender. Then he said, "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," I whispered. "No one should spend what isn't theirs. Not you, not Denise, not anyone." For a fleeting second, I saw conflict in his eyes. The boy he once was breaking through the man he had become. But then the mask settled again. "Denise won't forgive this. She says if you don't change, she doesn't want me to come here anymore." My chest tightened, but I stayed steady. "Then that is her choice. And if you choose her demands over my love, that is yours." His jaw clenched, and he stood abruptly. "You'll regret this when you're sitting alone." The words echoed the threat I had already heard, but this time they no longer pierced as deeply. Alone, I thought. Yes, better alone than bled dry. After he left, I went into the garden. The sun was sinking, painting the sky in streaks of gold and violet. I pressed my hands into the soil, feeling its cool strength, and whispered a prayer, not for money, not even for safety, but for courage. Courage to endure what lay ahead, whether reconciliation or further betrayal. The geraniums swayed gently in the breeze, and I thought, they bloom because they are rooted, not because the wind is kind. That night, as I prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, the phone rang again. Denise's voice cut through the air like glass. "You're tearing this family apart, Sylvia. Harold doesn't deserve a mother who treats him this way. If you cared about him, you'd prove it by helping us. Instead, you cling to your precious money. Do you want him to walk away from you forever?" I let her words wash over me, then replied with calm I didn't know I had. "If Harold walks away, it will not be because of me. It will be because he chose to." I hung up before she could answer. In the quiet that followed, I sat at the table and realized something profound. Their threats no longer frightened me. The house was still mine, my name still on every bill, my garden still blooming. For the first time in years, I felt the faintest trace of freedom, like a door cracking open after being locked tight. But I also knew the storm had not passed. No, this was only the eye, and the darker clouds still waited beyond. The days that followed were filled with a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief, because I had finally spoken truths that had lived too long in my chest. Dread, because I knew Harold and Denise were not finished with me. Each ring of the phone made my stomach tighten. Each shadow passing across the front porch made me glance up from my sewing with a flutter of fear. I had lived through poverty, through widowhood, through illness, but nothing had prepared me for the slow cruelty of being betrayed by my own blood. On Saturday evening, just as the sun slipped behind the trees, the pounding at my door returned. This time it was Denise, not Harold. She pushed past me before I could speak, her perfume thick in the air, her eyes flashing with contempt. "You are destroying my marriage," she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "Harold is torn in two because of you. Do you think he'll choose a bitter old woman over his wife?" She stood in my living room as if she owned it, her hand on her hip, her words sharp enough to slice. I steadied myself by gripping the back of a chair. "Denise, you've mistaken generosity for weakness. I will not apologize for finally protecting what belongs to me." She laughed, a cruel sound. "Protecting? You call hoarding your money while your family struggles protecting? You should be grateful we even want to include you. Most women your age are abandoned." Her words cut like shards of glass, but I kept my chin high. "I raised Harold with my own two hands," I replied. "I fed him, clothed him, paid for every book, every chance he had. You have no right to stand in my home and call me ungrateful." Her smile twisted into something darker. "Then prepare yourself, Sylvia. If you won't give willingly, we'll find another way. Harold deserves more than your scraps." And with that, she stormed out, the door slamming so hard the walls trembled. That night, sleep would not come. I lay awake listening to the creaks of the house, each one sounding like footsteps, each gust of wind against the shutters like a warning. I rose before dawn and sat with Robert's Bible, tracing verses with my fingers until the sun rose. The words whispered strength back into my bones. I told myself that no matter what came next, I would not surrender. On Monday, Harold arrived alone again, his face pale, his movements restless. He sat heavily in the armchair across from me and rubbed his hands together. "Mama, Denise says you threatened her." His voice was quiet, but it carried accusation. I met his gaze steadily. "I did not threaten her. I told her the truth, that I will no longer allow her to misuse me. If she felt threatened, it is because the truth frightened her." He sighed, leaned forward, and for the first time in weeks, his eyes softened with something like shame. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. "She's furious, but I don't want to lose you, Mama." My heart ached at those words, but I also knew that words without actions were empty. "Then you must decide who you will stand with. Harold," I told him. "A wife who spends and deceives, or the mother who carried you through every storm of your life?" His jaw worked as though the decision pained him, but he gave no answer. Instead, he rose, kissed the top of my head quickly, and left without looking back. The door closed softly this time, but the silence it left behind was no less heavy. That evening, I walked through my garden, touching each bloom as though to remind myself of what I had created with my own hands. The roses did not beg for more than I could give. The lilies did not lie or make demands. They simply thrived when tended, wilted when neglected, honest in their silence. I thought of Harold then, not the man he had become, but the boy he once was, running through this same yard with laughter spilling from his mouth. I prayed that somewhere inside him, that boy still lived, waiting to be found again. But as the night fell and shadows stretched long across the yard, I knew the truth. The fight was not finished. Denise would not let go so easily, and Harold was too tangled in her web to see clearly. The storm was not behind me. It was still gathering, darker and closer than ever before. The final confrontation came on a Thursday afternoon when the air was heavy with the promise of rain. I was in the kitchen kneading dough for bread, the smell of yeast warm and comforting, when the sound of a car screeched into my driveway. I wiped my hands and peered through the lace curtain. Harold and Denise stepped out together, their faces set in grim determination. My heart thudded, but I straightened my back and opened the door before they could knock. Denise's voice cut through the air before she even crossed the threshold. "This nonsense ends today. Either you give us access, or we'll do what we must without your permission." She pushed past me, dragging Harold behind her, and planted herself in the center of my living room like a queen demanding tribute. Harold avoided my eyes, his jaw clenched. I placed the dew bowl on the counter, wiped my hands slowly on a towel, and turned to face them. "This is my house, my money, my life. I owe you nothing but the truth, and the truth is this: I will not be used any longer." Denise's eyes flashed with fury. "You selfish, bitter old woman. You'll die alone clutching those pennies while we struggle. Is that what you want?" I felt the old rage rising, but I pushed it down, speaking instead with the quiet strength of someone who had lived long enough to know storms pass. "What I want, Denise, is respect. What I want is peace in my own home. If that means being alone, then so be it. I will not sacrifice my dignity to buy false love." For a moment, the room held its breath. Harold finally lifted his eyes to mine, and in them I saw a flicker of a boy's sorrow, a man's shame. But Denise grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. "Come on," she spat. "She's made her choice." Harold hesitated just long enough to whisper, "Mama, I—" But the words withered before they bloomed. He let Denise pull him away, and the door slammed behind them. I stood rooted to the floor, listening as their car roared down the street, tires squealing like wounded animals. Then the silence returned, but this time it felt different, not suffocating, not heavy, but cleansing, like the air after a storm. I sank into my old armchair, the one that had carried me through grief and joy alike, and let the tears flow freely. Not just tears of sorrow, but of release. I had drawn a line and held it, and though it cost me dearly, it was mine to draw. The house seemed to breathe with me, each creak and sigh no longer a threat but a reminder that I was still here, still strong, still standing. As night fell, I lit a single lamp and opened Robert's Bible again. My eyes landed on a verse that seemed written for this very day. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." I closed the book and whispered into the quiet. "I have stood firm, Robert. I have stood firm." The storm outside finally broke, rain hammering the roof, wind rattling the shutters. But inside, I felt something new, something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. The freedom of knowing that I had chosen myself, that I had not let the hunger of others devour the last of my years. And now, as I sit here telling you this story, my dear listener, I want to ask you something. If my words touched you, if you felt the weight of my struggle, and the strength it took to say no, then please subscribe to this channel. Not just for me, but for the countless stories yet to be told, the voices of those who have endured, resisted, and found their courage. When you subscribe, you become part of this family, not the kind that drains and deceives, but a community built on truth and support. Share your own stories in the comments, because together we heal when we speak, we grow when we listen, and we learn when we reflect. Tell me if you have faced betrayal, or if you've had to draw your own lines in the sand. And if this story taught you something about dignity, about strength, about the power of saying no, let us know. Because every lesson shared here becomes a light for someone else, still stumbling in the dark. So don't just watch and walk away. Subscribe, join us, speak with us. Together, we can turn pain into power, silence into solidarity, and stories into strength. And from my heart to yours, thank you for sitting with me through this journey. May we all find the courage to stand firm when the storm comes.